Good morning, everyone. It is great to finally be here. I think D-Congress invited me 2 years ago, so it's great to finally be with you to talk about trust, a really big word and something that has become even more important in our lives over the last 2 years. So what I'd love to do with our time together is to help you think differently about trust, to really understand what it is and why it's so important to our lives and when we make purchase decisions. What is the role of trust in the world of commerce? So let's start big. Let's start with a definition of trust, because it's one of those words that we use a lot, but when you ask people to define what trust is, it's quite hard to get our heads around because it's not something that is hard. It's not even a brand attribute. Trust is a feeling. It's something that we feel towards people, towards companies, towards products and services. Now, I love the fact that trust is the most defined sociological concept in our lives. It has more definitions than love. And my definition of trust is really simple. Trust is a confident relationship with the unknown. A confident relationship with the unknown. And when you start to see trust through this lens, you start to understand why it's the foundation in our lives, why every purchase decision hinges on trust, why trust enables us to give our money, our data, information, try new things, trust products and services when we can't see how they're made. Trust is the very foundation of our lives and the social glue of relationships. And we're really going to dive into how it works and how you earn trust and what makes products, services, and people trustworthy. I thought, though, I'd start with a story because I've been studying trust now for over a decade, and it's always interesting to sort of ask yourself where this fascination came from. And I realized when I was writing Who Can You Trust, that for me, it started really early, that I had an experience when I was a child of giving my trust to the wrong person. So what happened was my mum decided when I was about 5 years old that she wanted to go back to work and that she needed to hire someone to look after my brother and I. So she placed an advert in this magazine called The Lady. Now this was in the early 80s where we didn't have email, we didn't have video conferencing, so she would rely on some written references and a phone call. And I'll never forget the day this woman walked into our lives, and her name was Doreen. And she came into our house, and we were living in London. And what I remember so clearly was that she was wearing a uniform, a navy uniform, and she had a bonnet. And for some reason, she was carrying a tambourine. Now, the reason why she was wearing this uniform was because she worked for this charity called the Salvation Army. And my mum said this was one of the reasons why she hired her, is that she told my mum that she loved helping people. Now, she lived with us for around 9 months, and I don't really remember anything strange about her. In fact, I remember her being quite cheerful and friendly. And then one weekend, she disappeared. And by Sunday, my parents start to really worry about what has happened to Doreen. So they go next door to our neighbor's house, because our nanny was friendly with their nanny, and the neighbor's called Mr. Luxembourg, and he says to my dad, "It's so funny that you've come round this evening, because I've just found out that your nanny and my nanny are running one of the largest drugs rings in North London." Now, you're going to have to trust me this is a true story, because it is a true story. So now my parents are hoping that Doreen does not come home, and they go up to her bedroom and they find all kinds of things you really don't want in your house, and they discover that she's taken credit cards and she's stolen money, and there's lots of other things hiding under the bed. Well, a couple of days later, Doreen still hasn't returned, but there is a knock at the door, and it's the police. and they've come to arrest my dad because Doreen has taken our family's silver Volvo estate, our car, and she has used it as a getaway car in an armed robbery. Now, this is a dead true story, and I love to share this story to remind my parents that they left me in the care for 9 months of a drug-dealing, armed bank robber. Now, yes, this did give me a fascinating topic to study later on in life. But the reason why I'm telling you this story is it's actually a beautiful illustration of how we often make trust decisions, that we don't always give our trust to the right people and the right things. And one of the reasons for this is really because often we don't look for the right information. One of my favorite trust theorists is a person called Diego Gambetto, and he puts it beautifully. He says, trust has 2 enemies, not one: bad character and poor information. Now, the great thing in your world, looking after brands, looking at marketing, is that you can help with this. You can help give consumers better information so that we give our trust to the right products and services. So that's what I'd like to give you, is some principles of how we can help people make smarter trust decisions. How can we help people make smarter trust decisions? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to look at some pretty fundamental questions that we all need to be asking when we're thinking about our companies and the products and services that we're selling. So the first big question is, who can you trust? Clearly not Scottish Salvation Army nannies, but who can you trust? And to do this, I would like to run a quick exercise with you. And the way this exercise works is really simple. I would like you to pick one of these brands, Amazon, Uber, or Facebook, and I'd like you to pick the brand that you trust the most. Don't overthink it, and I'm going to say them out loud, and for the brand that you trust the most, I'd like you to clap really loudly, okay? So if you trust Amazon the most, clap really loudly now. Great. If you trust Uber the most, clap now. We have some Uber fans in the house, clearly. Okay. If you trust Facebook the most, clap now. I would love to ask this lady why she's clapping so enthusiastically, but I would call that tepid, right? Like, clearly some trust issues there. Okay, now you've got the idea. We're going to do it in reverse, and we're going to do it with politicians. Now, do you know it's remarkably easy to find photos of politicians eating ice cream, which I never knew. But the way this is going to work is I want you to pick the politician that you trust the least. No judgment. And it wouldn't be appropriate to clap, so you can boo very, very loudly. So, Biden, Putin, or Johnson, my prime minister. Okay, so if you trust Biden the least, you can boo really loudly. Boo now. Woo! Gentleman at the back. That was a good boo. I like it. Okay. If you trust Putin the least, you can boo now. It's a very different boo. Right. Okay, great. And maybe you only get one boo on this one, by the way. If you trust Johnson the least, you can boo now. Over here, right? Like it was collective over here. So why are we doing this exercise? It's actually a terrible exercise, asking someone who do they trust, who don't they trust. But it's often how we talk about it in life. Or when you read research, we don't trust media, and we don't trust government, and we don't trust this brand. We talk about trust in a really generalized way. And it misses something really important for trust to really become useful, which is to do what? Who can you trust to do what? You know, Amazon's really interesting. If I'd asked you, I think you're clapping because when you ordered something on Amazon, you trust that it will arrive the next day. But if I said, do you trust that Amazon treat their people fairly, or that they pay their fair share of taxes, you may have given me a really different answer. Many of you clap for Uber, and that's probably because when you press the app on your phone that you trust that a car is going to show up. But if I said you trust that they treat their drivers well, you may have given me a different answer. The leaders are really interesting because even that is contextual. It's often related to our relationship with them. Are we familiar with them? You know, I trusted Biden when he was vice president. I'm not sure how I feel about him as president. Johnson, I don't know. I trust him to throw a really good party. I don't know what I trust him for. And Putin, I'm really not sure, right? But they all have a context around which we can trust. So when we're thinking about our own companies, when we're thinking about products and services, we need to take trust away from this sort of generalized language, this generalized way of thinking, and bring it back into context. How do we rethink context around our products and services? Where do people trust our brands? And where do we fall short? And where could we improve? So trust is highly subjective and it is highly contextual. The second big question I want us to think about is the role trust plays in helping us to try new things. One of the things that we often don't think about is the relationship between trust, risk, and innovation. When, in fact, if trust didn't exist, we wouldn't be able to innovate. We wouldn't be able to try new things. Now, the way I visualize this, I should say I started my life as an artist, so you're going to see lots of little sketches trying to take these quite complex ideas and make them simple. The way I think about the way trust enables innovation, enables us to take risks, is an idea I call the trust leap. Now, what's interesting is when you look at all different situations in our lives, trust works in a very similar way. So when you're asking someone to try a new product, when you introduce a new policy, when you change a payment system, when you're suggesting a new restaurant, when you introduce a new customer service person, whatever it may be, there is an element of something unknown. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to move that person from the known. And what we know about human beings is they love the known. The known is where we feel safe. The known is what feels familiar to us. So we're asking someone to take a trust leap into the unknown. And in between the known and the unknown is this big sea of uncertainty. And what we see is the reason why people often don't try new products and services isn't because it's not a bad idea or isn't because of the technology, it's because they simply aren't ready to take a trust leap. So trust leaps, once you see them, you start to notice them everywhere. And they're not new to our lives, but they are being accelerated by technology. Trust leaps happen whenever we ask someone to take a risk, to do something new, or to do something differently. And the interesting thing in the pandemic is in many areas of our lives, trust leaps have been accelerated. So as you're very familiar with, payment mechanisms have been transformed over the last 18 months. In the UK, contactless payments are up 28%. And that is just in the last 12 months, our payment habits have changed. And the interesting question is, will that trust leap ever go back? You know, I went into a shop the other day and I went to try and pay with money, and it was, oh, I don't want your money, right? Like, I only want your phone, or I want a card. And that's happened relatively quickly. I got to know the company Kry, which I know came from Sweden, a virtual health company. And I was really amazed when I first went online with the doctor how positive the experience was. I assumed that I wouldn't feel any kind of connection, but in many ways, that experience felt more personal than when I went into a physical office with my doctor at home. And then, of course, we've seen massive trust leaps reinvent industries. My first book was actually on the sharing economy, which I started writing about in 2008. And I remember going to regulators and going to investors. I remember giving a talk to Hilton and saying that this really small company called Airbnb was going to transform the travel industry. And I kid you not, people laughed at me. Trust leaps can change our behaviors and reinvent the way we shop, the way we travel, the way that we pay for things. And this really brings me to a really important point in the role of trust in commerce. That in any organization, in any marketplace, in any business, you have two currencies that are constantly flowing. And these currencies often are at tension. They often pull on one another. You have the currency of money. And of course, money is important. Money enables us to pay for things. Money enables us to transact. But there is another currency that we have to pay equal, if not more, attention to, and that is the currency of trust. And the way I think about it is that money is the currency of transactions, trust is the currency of interactions. And the more you want to interact with people, the more deeply you want to be involved in their lives, the more trust that you need. Every touch point, every interaction with a customer is an opportunity to earn or to undermine trust. Now, I would love for you to experience a little trust leap yourselves so that the next time you ask someone else to take a trust leap, you can think about this experience. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to play a very short game. So what I would like you to do is I'd like you to take out your mobile phones, just take out your phones, and I'd like you just to wave them in the air like this so I can see that you've all got them. I do not believe you if you're pretending you do not have a phone, by the way. So, okay. Now I'd like you to give your phone, unlock it, by the way, unlock the phone. Right, and now I'd like you to give it to the person sitting next to you. It can be on your left or your right. I know some people are a bit distant, so this gentleman just reached behind. It's not a reason not to play the game. Excuse me. And I'm going to give you, you know what I'm going to ask you to do? You're all like playing with each other's phones. You have 30 seconds. It's just 30 seconds of your life, and you can do whatever you want with that person's phone. 30 seconds, okay? 1, 2, 3, off you go, 30 seconds. You got 10 more seconds. Okay. Shh. Wow, okay. You can give the phones back now. Right. Now, some of you, I do not want to know what you found on that person's phone. The lady is laughing away. Okay. Now, what's interesting is I can see all of you, which is wonderful. And some of you, you really didn't want to play, right? So you were like, it's a bit far to give someone a phone, or I'll just keep pretending I don't have a phone, or I'll just sit here and 30 seconds feels like a really long time, okay? And then there was a large group of you that you swapped phones, but it just felt really uncomfortable, right? Like, what am I going to find on that person's phone, right? And then there's a small group of you that I don't know what you were doing, tweeting, Instagramming, sending messages from that phone. You could do a lot, actually, in 30 seconds on that person's phone. And the reason I want you to experience this is because we often ask people to share a lot from their phones without thinking about the trust state that they are in. And trust states are a really powerful way to think about mindsets and behaviors. Those of you who didn't really want to play, and I get it, I wouldn't really want to play that game, are in a low trust state. You don't want to take that risk. You don't want to try something new. And then the people who are sharing messages and going straight into that person's phone, they are in a high trust state. And this is one simple exercise with this room to show you how we respond differently to taking all kinds of risks, particularly risks that involve something really personal and involve sharing some data and information. So this is really important. I've worked with companies and they do really complex market segmentation and user testing, but they rarely ask this question. What trust state is someone in? Because the person who's in a low trust state needs different information and different user experience, different kinds of support for them to take that risk to do something new. The person who's in a high trust state might be already ready to make a purchase. So what trust state is someone in? So the third question I want to look at is, how do you enable these trust leaps to happen? So if we know the way we get people to try new things is we need to get them from this known and safe and familiar place into this unknown place, how can we help support people in this process? Now, there are many different ways to do this, but I thought I'd give you two really powerful principles. And I'm going to say up front is that you can use these principles responsibly, and you can also use them to manipulate consumer behavior, and you'll see why. So the first principle we're going to call the California roll principle. And for those of you who love sushi, you may know this story. But what happened was when sushi was first introduced into the United States in the early 1960s, the California roll didn't exist. Well, the way it came in was that actually the seaweed was on the outside and there was no avocado. And this was a time when people were still eating fairly traditional food. You know, it was common just to have meat and 2 veg for dinner. And a chef in Los Angeles said, this food is too strange for people. They don't understand what it is. So let's invert the role. Let's put the unfamiliar ingredient, the seaweed, on the inside and the rice on the outside, and let's add some avocado that people can see. And this became the California roll, and really was the reason why sushi took off in the US, was the California roll, because people understood what it was. And this highlights a really important principle when it comes to trust. There is a brilliant book called Hooked by Nir Eyal, which is all about the psychology of the familiar. And he puts it beautifully. He calls it strangely familiar. Some people call it the mere exposure effect. But the way it works is that actually, for all the talk of new things and innovation, it's not how the human brain works. We don't want something entirely new. We want the familiar done differently. Now, what's fascinating is once you see and get strangely familiar, you start to recognize it in all these different parts of design. So going back to example Cree, what do you recognize about the person here? What's interesting about this doctor in this app? Just shout it out. Stethoscope. He doesn't need a stethoscope because he can't physically examine you, right? He doesn't really even need the coat. But it's strangely familiar. If he just showed up in his PJs you wouldn't really trust him, right? He looks like a doctor. It's a very clever design touch point. Apple, and you can read Jony Ive's principle, his design principle, is strangely familiar. And Apple are geniuses in the concept of skeuomorphism. So how do you take new things? And if you look at your phone right now, you'll see that the icons look like things in the real world. And the interesting thing, if you want to get really geeky about it, is look at icons and how they start really like realism, right? So they really resemble that object. And then over the 10 years, they move further and further away. They can become more abstract and conceptual because people are more familiar with them. So how can you think about this idea of strangely familiar? What is the equivalent principle and the role it plays within your products and services? The second big idea that's really important when you're thinking about how you get people to take risks, particularly in the digital world, is this idea that I call the trust stack. And the trust stack is really about thinking of the different layers of trust that exist in these interactions. Now, this doesn't always work, I should say, in a linear way. But the first layer of the stack is that you have to trust and understand the idea. If you don't get the idea, you don't really move on. The next layer of the stack has become increasingly important. So when I started studying how trust works in platforms over 10 years ago, and this was really looking at marketplaces like eBay, like Etsy, like Amazon, dating apps like Tinder, travel marketplaces like Airbnb, the big assumption was that trust would really exist on this top layer of the stack, that we were entering this peer-to-peer world where the trust in the company and the trust in the platform wouldn't be as important as trust between two people. And that hasn't been the case. If you look at where platforms are running into trouble, and that could be platforms like Facebook or like Uber, it's because they underestimated how important this platform layer is. Who is responsible when things go wrong? How does that platform really work? What is the behavior and the culture of the people and the company behind that platform? So this middle layer of the stack is absolutely key when we think about trust in digital environments. And then the last layer of the stack is trust in people. And I should say that the person could be a real human being, or it could be an artificially intelligent bot. But whenever we feel like in some way we're interacting with a person. Now, just to bring this to life, I thought I would share an example with Airbnb. And this is a company that I have really known since it first started. And everyone, I tell you, everyone said that this was a terrible idea, that strangers would never trust one another, and yet it is now the most valuable hospitality company in the world. And what Airbnb understands is that they are not just a marketplace. They are driven by trust. And they get that you have to trust the idea. You have to trust the platform. And then ultimately, you have to trust the person. So what does the trust stack look like in your platform or in your marketplace? Okay. The fourth idea I'd love for you to think about is the relationship between transparency and trust. And the reason why is because I've seen this become sort of an obsession in many companies, this idea of transparency. So I'd love to do a quick raise of hands. How many of you have heard this idea, talked about it within your own company or maybe with clients, that the way, please don't photograph this slide. I don't want you taking away this slide, right? But just raise your hands. The way that we're going to build more trust is to be more transparent. Just raise your hand if this is something you've heard or something that you believe. Okay, quite a lot of you. Great. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is if you have a piece of paper and a pen, if not, don't worry, you can just do it in your heads. But if you have a piece of paper and a pen, I'd like you to draw this graph. So I'm going to do it with you. And what I'd like you to draw is, whoops, that was good. Trust, I'll do it again, hang on a second. Oh, that's good too. Right. So, trust, transparency. Okay. And what I'd like you to draw is what happens to trust as you make things more transparent. So, you make things more transparent. What do you think happens to trust? So, if you could just draw that, that would be great. Or just draw it in your heads. Okay. Right. I'm wondering, how many of you... imagine it looks something like this. Just raise your hand. Okay. Can I ask, you're just going to shout, why, this gentleman here in the middle, why do you think it looks like this? So you think the plateau is because people can question what they see, so they start to have more questions. Okay. And why do you think it has a positive start? Get to know each other. Great. Okay. Now, some of you may have drawn or visualized, ooh, maybe you work in HR or legal. It wasn't such a good idea, this transparency thing, right? Did anyone draw anything like this? This gentleman here, why did you draw or imagine something like this? This gentleman here. It felt right. Okay, who else imagined something like this? This lady here. Why did you draw that? You can share too much information. And what happens when you share too much information? Trust goes down. Right, okay, so I do not want you taking away that I think that transparency is a bad thing. I don't think transparency is a bad thing in certain situations. But this idea of promising to become transparent, a fully transparent organization or a completely transparent brand, and you know what, that's going to really help trust. It simply isn't true. Yes, transparency can be useful early on in a relationship. As this gentleman here said, it can help us to get to know one another. Disclosing information, oh, you have nothing to hide, I believe what you're saying, I understand where you're coming from. But you can reach a point where a couple of things happen. First of all, what the customer expects you to share and what you're willing to share or what you can legally share become misaligned. And so much of trust is earned and destroyed around expectations. I see this in cultures everywhere, that where they fall down, whether it's in their internal cultures or with the promises they make, is they are not clear around setting expectations. And this happens with transparency. Well, transparency to the customer might mean that you're going to share absolutely everything, including how much you're paid and the bonuses that you make. Or as this lady said, the more people find out, the more questions that they have, the more suspicious that they become. And the interesting thing, if you think about it, going back to where we started, that trust is a confident relationship with the unknown. So what are you doing if you're making things transparent? You're reducing the need for trust. You're not increasing trust, you're reducing how much trust is required. So more transparency doesn't equal more trust. And the interesting thing is, we get this when it comes to our personal lives. You know, when governments say they want us to be transparent around where we're going or our travel behaviors, that doesn't feel like trust. You know, I have a good friend of mine, and she has a great relationship with her husband, but she tracks him on her phone. She checks his messages. Now, that may be a loving relationship, but it's not a trusting relationship, right? So we get this in our personal lives, but then when it comes to work, we suddenly think that transparency is a good thing when it comes to trust. So the way I would like us to think about transparency is to think of it as a tool, that we know there is a problem, and when we shine a light on that problem and we disclose information around it, it will somehow drive accountability and change, and not thinking about it as this ideal attribute or this end state. Okay, the last big question that I'd like us to look at is this question, and it must be the #1 question I'm asked. How do I build trust? How do I build trust? And that could be as a company, it could be as a leader, or it could be even as an industry. So the banks will often say, how do we build trust? Now, this question in itself is really interesting, the language of this question, particularly the word build. And the reason why it's so interesting is because it assumes that you are in control of this trust process. When actually what happens is whenever you're in a situation where you're asking someone to trust, you have a trust giver and you have a trust receiver. The trust receiver is the one that wants your trust and is trying to demonstrate that you can trust them. Well, just shout out, who has the power in this relationship? The giver or the receiver? Giver, receiver, receiver, giver. Interesting. Well, the receiver does have power in the sense that they can behave in ways that are trustworthy, but ultimately it's the giver, because the giver decides whether to give you their trust. And the most frustrating thing is you can behave in ways that are really trustworthy, and the giver can still decide, I don't trust you. So instead of thinking about this idea of building trust, and I know it sounds like being pernickety with language, but it's actually a shift in mindset. What we want to think about is, how do we earn trust? How do we continuously earn trust from people? And think of it as a process, a journey that we're continuously on. Right, so to bring this to life, we're going to do one last exercise. And to do this, I'd like you to stand up. Don't worry, we're not going to do any stretching or anything like that, dancing, but just stand up. And the exercise is, do you trust me? Me, Rachel, this person here, right? Do you trust me? And the way this exercise works is that I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I will not take them personally, I promise you, right? Maybe a little bit. No, I'm joking. So if you don't trust me around this question, I really feel for the person who's just walked in. She's like, what on earth are we doing? But anyway, if you don't trust me, just sit down, okay? So if you don't trust the question that I'm asking, you just sit down. Let's go for the first one. Do you trust my expertise in trust? Okay, one very brave person sat down, and I'm not going to look at him. He's now like, it's very courageous of you. Okay, would you trust me to drive your car? You don't have to stand back up. Hold your position. I respect that. Okay. Would you trust me to car? Wow. Who has a really nice car? Because I'd like to, no, I'm joking. Okay. Would you trust me to invest 100,000 of your money? That's a lot of you that just sat down. Okay. Would you trust me for fashion advice? No, you can't stand back up. It's not the way the game works. Right, last one. Would you trust me with a personal secret? Okay. We've got about 3-4 people standing, and they are obviously trust givers. They find it quite easy to give you their trust. Thank you very much. Please sit down, and thank you. There is no prize, by the way, or chocolates, right? Except for the brave person that sat down on the first question. You will get a very nice signed copy of my book, by the way. So, no, I'm joking. Now, why do we do this? It's really actually an interesting exercise, because all those questions, you have very little information to actually make a decision. You know, what's interesting is, would you trust me to be a trust expert? Actually, this gentleman's right. Very little information was given in my introduction. You don't know that I teach at Oxford. You don't know the academic work I've done. You don't know my credibility. So he's actually right to sit down. You don't know whether you trust my trust expertise. The investment one is really interesting, because you also don't know that I helped set up a venture fund. And this venture fund was very early investor in many of these marketplaces and platforms. So I could have actually helped you make a lot of money, for those of you who sat down. The car one, those of you who sat down are totally right, because I am one of the worst drivers in the world, right? I crashed my car on the way home from passing my driving test. I ended up in the police station, And I had to take more driving lessons after I'd passed my driving test. So you should never let me with your car. The only one actually you have information around is fashion advice, because I'm standing in front of you. Now, we did this because it highlights something really important. And I find this one really personally hard to get my head around, because I am someone that operates with my intuition. I feel like I feel people, that I read situations, and that I can pick up what I call on my gut. We shouldn't trust our gut. If you ever hire someone from your gut, really change your hiring processes, because you will end up with a drug-dealing nanny at some point in your life, because your brain is picking up on the signals that it wants to see. We are sending out trust signals all the time, and we often see the signals based on a very deep need or a very different want. Now, intuition has a role to play in certain areas of our lives where we have a lot of experience, because it's pattern recognition coming up to our brain. But often, when we want to make important trust decisions in our lives, we have to look for the right information. And the interesting thing is, we're often not taught what is the right information. What should we be sharing with people? What should we look for in other people? What should we be telling people and sharing with people to help them make better trust decisions? Well, the beautiful thing is there is actually a framework around this. In the social sciences, we've been studying for over 50 years now what makes something or someone trustworthy. What are the signals that we should be looking for to give someone our trust? And the way that I simplify this research down is, you can think of it in two boxes. The capability box, which is how we do things, and the character box, which is why we do things. And the interesting thing is that we're seeing a real shift in the importance of these two things, particularly in the world, through the lens of the consumer. Now, capability is still important. You still want those products and services to work. But the character of the company, and this is tied up with purpose and sustainability, who that company is rising in importance and value. So let's take this one level down. When we're thinking about trustworthiness, what we need to be thinking about is 4 traits: competence, reliability, integrity, and empathy. So let's start with this trait of competence. Competence is probably the easiest to understand. Competence, in our minds, what we do is we say, does this person or does this company, do they have the skills, the time, the knowledge, and the resources to do what they say they're going to do? And the interesting thing about competence is, what's equally important is, do they tell us what they're not capable of doing? Are they honest about what this person can't do or what this product or service cannot do? So this is the trait of competence. Then we have the trait of reliability. And reliability, is strongly related to time. Are we respectful of time? Are we responsive to people? Do we run our meetings on time? You've probably dealt with someone that is always canceling things and moving things. This can be incredibly damaging to trust. But underneath reliability, what we're essentially looking for is consistency. How consistent does that experience, does that person's behavior feel over time? And this is so important, because one of the biggest mistakes I see people make around trust is they think it comes from grand gestures, from these intense moments. That isn't how trust is earned. Trust is earned very slowly through small gestures over time. Now, these two traits of competence and reliability, they come together to create this feeling that you can depend on this person or this thing. It's going to do what it says it's going to do. And this is very important when it comes to trust. But there is this other side of character. So I'm getting over a cold, which is why I'm drinking the hot water. So character has 2 traits. And these 2 traits come down to empathy and integrity. So empathy is really this feeling that you care about someone, but that you take that feeling and turn it into some kind of support, that this person feels like they are going to be supported. And this feeling of care and support creates what we call psychological safety. And psychological safety is the foundation of trust. If someone doesn't feel safe with you, they will not trust you. It's a make or break for trust. But in my opinion, the most important trait in the world today, particularly as more and more of our lives get enabled by more and more complex technologies, is this point of integrity. Integrity is fascinating to understand. I personally don't like the definition of doing the right thing, because your right thing and my right thing might be two completely different things. Integrity can really be a compass for companies in terms of making decisions. And when you strip integrity back, what it comes down to is this idea of alignment. And it's asking this question, continually asking this question of, do my intentions and motives align with the best interests of the customer? Do my intentions and motives align with the best interests of the customer? The way that I'm pricing this product, the way that I'm sourcing these materials, the way our business model works. And you can see how much is at stake with integrity. Because if you look at where the tech companies are going wrong, the tech companies that really are in a state of crisis, and you strip it back, it's an integrity problem. And the interesting thing is that I think that one of the reasons why they are not earning trust back is because when they come out and make these apologies, they apologize through the capability lens. It was the system, it's the product, it's the algorithm, without ever acknowledging the culture, the incentives, the behaviors. Is the business model aligned with the best interest of the customer? And you can see this, right? When companies have a capability problem, say when like Samsung's phone started blowing up, it's easier to recover. When it's rooted in a character problem, it's really hard to earn back trust. So what we need to be doing is we need to be thinking about the information and the behaviors around these 4 traits. And to make good trust decisions around these 4 traits involves us doing something that feels very counterintuitive today: slowing down. Efficiency and speed, which is what we're trying to do with technology, accelerates these decisions. You know, think of how many times you just pick your phone up and you tap. You make these trust decisions really fast. And one of the things that we need to do is to actually think about, how do we create a trust pause? Not something that's annoying and gets in the way, but just a little bit of friction that allows someone to say, is this person, is this product, is this piece of information, is it worthy of my trust? You know, if you go back to my drug dealing nanny, if my mum had slowed down and asked for more information, she would have realized that actually that nanny was pretty capable, but I'm not sure her intentions were aligned with the best interests of our family. We need to learn how to create these trust pauses so that we can help people make better trust decisions. And so, to end, I'd like you, just for a few seconds, to think about 2 things. What can you rethink about trust? What is something you're going to walk out this room, and if you think differently about it, it could really change something in your life or in your business? And what is one small thing that you could do right now that would make you more trustworthy, that would make you more worthy of someone else's trust? And when we keep asking these simple questions, what we're doing in our own small ways is thinking about our own responsibility in continuously earning trust in our relationships, in our businesses, and really taking care of what is one of our most valuable and fragile assets that we have in our lives, and that is the currency of trust.